Something has been quietly wrong with British food for years now. Not wrong in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. Wrong in the way a familiar song sounds slightly off. You buy the same biscuits you have bought for 30 years, and they taste a little thinner. You pick up a ready meal and glance at the ingredients list, and there is something in there you cannot pronounce, wedged between two things that used to be the main event. You open a chocolate bar and the wrapper is the same, but the bar inside is somehow smaller, lighter, less satisfying. You do not say anything out loud, but you notice. You already know it. And this is what is actually happening. Here is what most people do not realize. The change to British food has not come from one decision, one scandal, one bad actor. It has crept in through dozens of small choices made over decades, hidden in plain sight on supermarket shelves across the country, and it is spreading faster than anyone expected. Take Margaret. She is 63 years old, a retired school dinner lady from Stoke-on-Trent, and she has been doing her weekly shop at the same supermarket for over 25 years. She told a community group recently, "The food looks the same, the labels look the same, but it does not feel the same going down." She is not imagining it, and she is far from alone. Here is the first thing you need to understand. Britain has quietly become one of the most ultra-processed food nations in the developed world. The term sounds clinical, but it describes something you feel every single day. Ultra-processed food is not just crisps and fizzy drinks. It is the loaf of bread with 15 ingredients when flour, water, yeast, and salt should cover it. It is the yogurt that has been fat-stripped, sweetened, thickened, and stabilized until the original dairy is almost a footnote. It is the frozen lasagne where the cheese sauce contains no cheese you would recognize. The Food Standards Agency tracked this through its monthly consumer research, and the numbers that came back were stark. When people were asked about their concerns, nearly 9 in 10 cited food prices, and more than 3/4 said they were worried about the overprocessing of food. That is not a fringe concern. That is the mainstream of British life, and nobody in power seems to be moving with any urgency to address it. In 2024, the House of Lords Committee on Food, Diet, and Obesity took formal evidence on the subject. The language they used was unusually direct for a parliamentary committee. They described the rapidly growing evidence linking ultra-processed food to poor health outcomes as alarming. They called on the government to tackle the overconsumption of less healthy foods and to ensure a healthy and affordable diet for all. That report landed. And then, quietly, not very much changed. To be fair, this is not the only cause of what you are feeling in the food on your plate. Global commodity prices, supply chain pressures, the long tail of a cost of living crisis that pushed food prices up by over 19% in the year to March 2023, the highest rate seen since 1977. Those forces are real, and they affect every producer and every retailer from Tesco down to the corner shop. The problem is complicated, and blaming any single cause would be dishonest. But here is where it gets harder to brush aside. It is not just about price. It is about what they put in the food when the price of the real thing gets too expensive. There is a practice the government's own Food Security Digest named openly. It is called skimflation. Not the shrinkflation you have probably already noticed, where the packet gets smaller but the price stays the same. Skimflation is quieter and harder to spot. It is when the recipe changes, when cheaper oils replace the good fat, when the cocoa gets quietly diluted until a product can no longer legally be called chocolate, when the meat content in your meat pie crosses a threshold that would have appalled the woman who made the original recipe 40 years ago. The government's own Digest documented biscuit products that had to be reformulated because they no longer contained enough cocoa to be marketed under their original name. The palm oil and the shea oil had crept in and pushed the cocoa out. The packet still looked the same. The branding still looked the same. But what was inside had fundamentally changed. Drop your town in the comments. Tell us whether you have noticed this on the shelves where you shop, because what we are hearing from people across Britain is that this is not regional. This is everywhere. Now here is the part of the story that runs deeper than ingredients lists. The question of what goes into British food has been tangled up with bigger structural changes for years now. Before the country left the European Union, a set of shared standards governed what could and could not be in the food sold across the continent. Farmers, processors, and retailers all operated within the same framework. That framework was not perfect, but it was a floor, a shared minimum. Since that floor was removed, researchers and food policy experts have raised a concern that gets very little airtime in the mainstream conversation. The worry is not simply about standards being lowered. It is about the emergence of what one peer-reviewed analysis called a two-tier food system. One tier where high-quality British produce gets exported to markets that pay for it. And another tier where cheaper, lower-standard imported products fill the shelves that working people rely on. It is a hypothesis, and it is not settled science. But when you stand in a supermarket aisle and feel that something is slightly off, it is worth knowing that serious researchers are asking exactly the same question. And the Food Standards Agency itself has been quietly stretched. Inspections that used to enforce compliance have faced resource constraints. Oversight that used to be shared across a continent-wide network of regulators now falls on a domestic body that has had to absorb a massive increase in responsibilities while navigating budget pressures that affect every public institution in the country. A like helps more people find it. Takes 1 second. None of this means British food is unsafe. The overwhelming majority of what you buy in Sainsbury's or Asda or Morrison's will not harm you tomorrow. That is an important distinction, and it deserves saying out loud. The Food Standards Agency does real work, and real enforcement still happens. But safe and good are not the same thing. And the slow erosion of good, the slow march of the cheaper ingredient, the slightly thinner biscuit, the yogurt that behaves like a science experiment, the chocolate bar that has quietly stopped being chocolate in any meaningful sense, that erosion is real, and it is documented. Not by conspiracy theorists, by the House of Lords, by the Food Standards Agency's own consumer tracker, by the government's Food Security Digest, by the Office for National Statistics, which was tracking shrinkflation as far back as 2017. Here is what that means in practical terms for families trying to stretch a weekly budget. The people who can afford to opt out of ultra-processed food and seek out the whole, the seasonal, the genuinely made, they can do that. The people who cannot, and that is most people in this country right now, face a supermarket aisle that has been quietly stacked against them. In the same year that food bank usage reached historic levels, with the Trussell Trust distributing close to 3 million emergency food parcels across Britain, the food that remained affordable was also, by and large, the food that had been most altered from its original form. That is the cruelest part of the arithmetic. When money gets tight, you buy what you can afford. And what you can afford has very gradually become something different from what it used to be. More additives, more substitutes, more ingredients chosen for shelf life and cost margin rather than for taste or nutrition. Margaret from Stoke-on-Trent noticed it first in the bread, then in the biscuits, then in the frozen meals she relied on when she was too tired to cook from scratch. She did not have the language for what she was experiencing. She just knew the food had changed. This is not happening in some distant place. It is happening across Britain right now. And the people feeling it most are not food critics. They are not nutritionists. They are the people who've been feeding their families from the same supermarkets for 30 years and who know, in the way that only long experience teaches you, that something has quietly shifted. The research backs them up. More than half of British adults report that whether a food is ultra-processed affects their choices, but nearly all of them struggle to accurately identify which products actually qualify. The system is built in a way that makes it very hard to see clearly. The labels are long and written in small print. The ingredient names are technical. The branding is warm and familiar even when the contents have moved a long way from what the brand once stood for. You can spend 20 years buying the same tin of soup and never know that somewhere in the middle of that 20 years, the recipe changed twice and the salt content went up and one of the original vegetables got quietly substituted for a cheaper, blander alternative. Because the label's mostly the same and the tin looks the same. And it is only when you sit down with it and something is slightly off that the question surfaces. Here is what none of this means. It does not mean every food manufacturer is acting in bad faith. Many producers are caught in genuine margin pressure between rising input costs, supermarket contracts that leave them almost nothing to work with, and consumers who, entirely reasonably, will not pay more when money is already stretched to breaking point. The economics are brutal and real, and do not reduce to simple villains. That honesty matters. But here is what it does mean. The quiet wrongness that you have been feeling at the dinner table is not in your head. It is not nostalgia distorting your memory of how things used to taste. It is a documented, studied, named shift in the composition of British food, driven by cost pressure, regulatory change, and structural decisions made over decades that prioritize cheap supply over consistent quality. The bread you buy today contains more than bread should contain. The chocolate you unwrap is lighter and smaller and less chocolatey than the version your parents unwrapped in the same wrapper. The ready meal sits in its tray full of ingredients designed to survive a warehouse and a microwave rather than to nourish a person at the end of a long day. None of that happened overnight. None of it happened because of a single decision you could point at. It happened in the way that most important things happen in Britain, quietly, gradually, without anyone quite announcing it. And most people still cannot name it. But you can feel it every time you open the cupboard, every time you glance at an ingredients list that is twice as long as it needs to be, every time you sit down to a meal that is technically food, but feels like a slightly unconvincing version of the real thing. Something has been quietly wrong with British food for years, and now you know what it is. The question is this. When you look at what is in your trolley this week, and you think about what you could actually afford to change, does the system make it possible for you to make that choice? Or has the choice already been made for you?